Well, I think the first point of comparison is that the longer telegram is much, much longer than the long telegram. In fact, I think the longer telegram that was published last week, its executive summary is almost as long as Kennan's original long telegram. So that's one point of comparison. I think in terms of what they have in common, they clearly both attempt to serve the same purpose of trying to kind of capture the strategic mindset of a major U.S. strategic competitor, Kennan's case, the Soviet Union, and in the anonymous author's case, China, obviously, to offer both an assessment of the strategic mindset of the opposing party, the strategy that it's pursuing in line with that mindset, and offering a proposal for a U.S. strategy to respond to it. I think one of the other differences, though, is this issue of anonymity. The long telegram was written by George Kennan in 1946, and it was not anonymous at the time. It was a State Department telegram. He was at the embassy in Moscow and was asked to explain Soviet foreign policy, and he responded with a very long telegram. There was an anonymous sequel to that. A year and a half later, he published a version of the same analysis in the journal Foreign Affairs under the title The Sources of Soviet Conduct and under the pseudonym X. And that was really only a fig leaf at the time, though. He published it anonymously because he had just been named the director of the policy planning staff at the State Department, and he needed some distance between his official job and his public analysis there. But the difference is that it was widely known at the time that Kennan was the author. So there was no real credible long-term claim of anonymity. Whereas the author of the report last week is anonymous, frankly, for reasons which remain unclear and mysterious to me. I think the longer telegram gets several things correct. I think it certainly identifies the magnitude of the challenge that China poses to the United States, the nature and the scope of it. I think it's got a pretty comprehensive and relatively accurate outline of China's strategy in pursuit of its objectives. And it's got a pretty exhaustive and comprehensive outline of the various areas where China is, the strategies and tactics that China is conducting in pursuit of that strategy and those objectives. I think the longer telegram also gets right the bottom line on the U.S. side of the equation, that a challenge of this magnitude does require a much more comprehensive, bipartisan, multifaceted, multi-pronged, long-term U.S. strategy to respond to it than we currently have. There are several areas where I diverge in both analysis and prescription with the author of the long telegram. I think on the China side of the equation, I think even though the author is accurate to an extent in characterizing, as I said, the magnitude of the challenge from China and the great scope of it, I think he nonetheless overstates China's strategic intentions and ambitions. China is clearly trying to maximize its wealth and power and influence relative to the United States. And as the author says, it's trying to kind of market its governance and development models as an alternative to that of the United States. So that's kind of the ideological component of the challenge. But I think that the author goes overboard in going beyond that and claiming that the Chinese are essentially trying to destroy liberal democracy. They're trying to impose it upon other countries in the world, and that they're trying, and that China seeks to supplant the United States as the global hegemon and to try to set up a Sinocentric world order. I just think that's beyond what China's ambitions actually are. My second objection to the analysis of China in the document is its overarching, inordinate emphasis on Xi Jinping. It seems to attribute most of China's strategic behavior and its strategic intentions to the personality and the personal ideological mindset of Xi Jinping. And I think this greatly risks overestimating the difference between Xi and the other members of the Chinese leadership on the core issues that are driving U.S.-China tensions in the Chinese perspective on the relationship. I think it also, again, despite the fact that Xi has made some substantial differences, or at least stylistic differences, I think the report overlooks what I see as the strategic drivers of the U.S.-China relationship and the U.S.-China tensions that predated Xi's tenure and are certain to outlast it. I think the second problem with this focus on Xi is that the report essentially advocates a U.S. policy targeted at exploiting the fault lines between Xi and other members of the Chinese leadership in an effort to kind of rein him in, and in fact even try to affect his, or at least pursue his eventual removal, with the assumption that we'll be able to deal with a more reasonable, accommodative leader if Xi Jinping is not there anymore. Now, I think it stops short of advocating direct regime change, but again, I think that exaggerates the difference between Xi Jinping and the kind of approach to the United States we're going to see from any alternative leader. I think it also runs a tremendous risk when it advocates trying to exploit fault lines in the Chinese leadership. This is exactly the kind of intervention in Chinese internal politics that gets their dander up and their nationalist aspirations. And in fact, I think that actually it's the kind of activity when the Chinese conducted in the United States ends up as a matter for the FBI. But I think that trying to cultivate sympathetic leaders or factions within the Chinese leadership only puts a target on their back within the leadership circles there, in terms of, well, anybody who's in China who's perceived as an advocate or an agent, even implicitly for U.S. preference and interests, is usually going to be in trouble. On the U.S. side of the equation, I had two substantial problems with the report. The first is that I think it essentially exaggerates, or at least risks exaggerating, the leverage that the United States has in terms of influencing Chinese decision-making and Chinese leadership thinking. I think, that should certainly be part of our strategy, but I think the report seems to reflect an exaggerated view of how much relative clout we have in dealing with China, and underestimates the resistance we're going to face in efforts to, well, as the report says, try to convince Chinese leaders what is in their best interests if they want to remain in power. I don't think we're going to be very successful with that approach. I think the last and the most profound exception I take to the US side of the equation is that the document essentially adopts as its premise that the US strategy needs to be based first and foremost of retaining US strategic primacy, both within East Asia and globally, and actually I think it says explicitly, for the rest of this century. That includes retaining US preeminence militarily, economically, technologically, for the foreseeable future. And unfortunately, I think this is just not a realistic foundation for any US strategy to have. Frankly, US no longer enjoys strategic primacy in East Asia or globally. And the report talks about the importance of US primacy in sustaining the liberal international order. I think, frankly, the liberal international order is not quite functioning the way we intended it to either. So I think the report needs to reassess what really is a vital interest in terms of what is sustainable. And I think we have to lower our ambitions beyond trying to retain something that we have already lost with this obsessive goal on retaining US primacy. Well, I think that flows from some of the concerns I have about the analysis. I think the two primary problems that I think this report would generate in terms of how the US should deal with China going forward is one, back to the Xi Jinping issue. I just think we need to get beyond the idea that Xi Jinping is exclusively the problem we're dealing with here. And I think that any strategy which focuses as exclusively on Xi as this document explicitly recommends that we do is going to be highly problematic because Xi is not the primary problem we're dealing with. We need to get beyond that. And secondly, just to reaffirm, I think we need to get beyond this emphasis on what the underlying US core interests and objectives are that we're trying to pursue here. We're not going to be able to get into a constructive relationship with China as long as we assume that we have the leverage in every level of the relationship, and that U.S. preeminence over China in every sphere of national power is a feasible approach to take. I think we just need to rationalize our approach to China and forge certainly a very comprehensive and effective and forward-leaning strategy toward dealing with China, but it's got to be based on viable and sustainable assumptions, and this one is not.